In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove and replace a front knuckle on a RAV4 located in the front wheel wells. Remove the hubcap. You can use a pry bar or a screwdriver, and that gives you better access to the lug nuts. So we're going to take the wheel off, 21mm socket, remove the lug nuts. When you have a wheel that's stuck like that, I take one lug nut and I put it back on by hand, a couple of turns, and I'll take a long pry bar or a rubber mallet, tap it. Remove the wheel. So we're going to remove the caliper as one piece. It has two mounting bolts. That's the bracket to the knuckle, 17mm socket, and we're going to back those off. Take the caliper off, and grab my caliper hook, bring it through the bolt, and I'll hang it up on the spring. Now we can remove the rotor. I'm going to remove the axle nut first, and that's a 30mm 12-point. We'll set that aside. So when replacing your knuckle, you should always purchase a new wheel bearing hub because it is bolted on. It's just like press on, you would always transfer a new bearing over. So it's the same kind of in the factor. It is bolted, but to take it off of the old knuckle, you got to hammer it off. You're going to cause damage to it. So I strongly recommend putting a whole new wheel bearing hub on when you put a new knuckle on. Now, if you're keeping the old wheel bearing hub, I would take it out of the knuckle to transfer it over while the knuckle is still in the vehicle because it's held steady by the control arm and the strut, and working this on the ground or on a bench, it's going to be all over the place. So I'm going to take the wheel bearing off. We're going to undo our 4 mounting bolts that are mounted on the back of the knuckle that holds the wheel bearing hub to the knuckle. So 17mm socket on all 4. We'll do this side first, then I'll twist the steering wheel so that we can get to the other side easier. Make sure you keep the bolts because you're going to need to reuse them. Now I'm going to go turn the steering wheel. Now that we've exposed this side, before I take these 2 mounting bolts off the wheel bearing hub, I'm going to take my ABS sensor out. 10mm socket. Take that bolt out of the way. And then grab your sensor and just pull. You can twist it sometimes. Might need a pair of pliers. So like a pair of pliers, you can just twist it and pull at the same time. Now I'm going to hang that up here out of the way. There's 1. 2. Now I'm going to take this one and just start it, just a couple of threads by hand. And that way when you hit that wheel bearing hub, it doesn't fall on the floor. All right, so now I've straightened my wheel back out so that I can get a good swing and hit this hub. So I turn the wheel. I'm going to end up turning it back and forth until I get this hub to break free. Yeah, it's breaking free. Now I'm going to turn it the other way. All right, so now I can take that bolt out. All right, now we'll just pull that hub right off. Might have to tap that axle. So we have to take everything off of this knuckle that's attached to it. The one thing is the flex hose. And that bolt is a 14mm socket or wrench. Take that off and just get that hose right up out of the way. Now I'm going to move over to the tie rod end, and I'm going to take that cotter pin out. I'm going to toss it away. Always use a new cotter pin. Now I'm going to take a 17mm socket and take that castle nut off. I'm not going to remove it all the way. I'm going to let it stay like that so that when I take a hammer and I hit it off that knuckle, it doesn't fall down. So now I'm going to move down to the lower control arm. I'm going to take the 3 mounting points of this ball joint to the control arm. 17mm socket, you've got 2 nuts and then a bolt. So now with a pry bar, I'm just going to pry that out. Just like that. Now before I take these strut bolts out, kind of hard to get at, so I'm going to take my caliper and my hook and I'm just going to relocate it, try to bring it up higher. There we go. 22mm socket and wrench. Doesn't matter which one you do, front, top, or bottom. We're going to remove the strut bolts. And last one. Now you can take that knuckle and just pull it right out. So now we're going to take the ball joint out and transfer it over to the new knuckle. I'm going to take this lock clip out, grab that hook, break it free, and then pull it right out. Set it aside, and we'll take that castle nut off. Now with a 19mm socket, I'm going to take that castle nut off. Set it aside. So before I take this ball joint out, I'm going to use a pickle fork and try not to damage that boot, which is going to be pretty possible in a vise. It's a lot easier. But of course, like anything, I'm going to start that castle nut just a couple of threads because I don't want that flying out and hitting my foot. So I'll take a pickle fork and I'm going to line it up and see if I can get that boot to peel back a little bit. Yeah, perfect. So when you are changing a knuckle, and this is why I said earlier, you really should get a new wheel bearing, and I'm going to push and say you really should get a new ball joint. Because look at the damage that can happen, especially if you use a pickle fork, you're damaging this boot. And plus you're going to have to hammer on it. You might have to take a air chisel. If you have that tool that pops it down, that's another specialty tool, but if you have it, it might work, but you could damage the threads. You know what's easier? Replacing the ball joint. So we already got our ball joint, so now I'm just going to install the ball joint in the new knuckle, and we'll discard the knuckle with the ball joint. So now I'm going to install my new ball joint. I'm going to install it in the knuckle first because it's a lot easier to torque this down without that axle in the way. So let's squeeze it all the way in, get it as tight as possible. So the actual castle nut is a 19mm socket, and we're going to tighten it to 68 foot-pounds. I'm going to take a look. Wow, I lucked out. The cotter pin hole lined right up. So once you've put it through, I'm just going to hammer it through the rest of the way. And because it hits the way it angled, it's hitting the back of the knuckle. But you just tap it in, tap that over, and I'm going to cut that excess. Just like that. Now we can bring it to the car and install it. All right, so we're going to bring it over to the car. And I can feel what a difference in that new ball joint. Like it's actually firm, sticks in place. I'm going to line up my knuckle into my strut. And now I'm going to put my lower bolts on. 2 nuts and a bolt, shall I say. I'm just going to hand start them on that ball joint, going through that control arm. Now the reason I do this is because with no weight on it, it's going to be easier to start this bolt that goes in the back. And I'll push that forward like that. Make sure I line the threads up. Start it by hand. Perfect. Now I'm going to put my 2 strut bolts in. I'm just going to pull up a little bit, line it up. The bottom one through, and then the top. Start the nuts by hand. Make sure that stays out of the way. So now I have a 19mm socket. I'm going to snug up the 2 nuts and then the bolt. I'm going to do the bolt first. And now I'm going to get my torque wrench and torque them to 98 foot-pounds. Torquing them to 98 foot-pounds. Before you tighten the bolts up, you want to snug the top first and make sure you push in on the knuckle. You want it to be in as far as possible, and then tighten it up at the same time. And then tighten the bottom one before torquing. So now we're going to torque the strut bolts to the knuckle, and that's 177 foot-pounds with that 22mm socket and wrench. Let's do the top one. Now we're going to put our outer tie rod into the knuckle. Go ahead and spin that knuckle if you can. Bring it over like that. Line up the tie rod in. Pop it through. And start that castle nut. That's a 17mm socket. We're going to snug it up. 17mm socket, and the outer tie rod end is 36 foot-pounds. Let's see if we can line up the hole in the castle nut. Now I'm going to take my new cotter pin, fish it through. I like to put the taller one on the top. Easy to grab with the cutters. And peel it over. And then cut it. Now I'm going to bring my caliper down and bolt up my flex hose on that knuckle. Let's bring it down in a nicer location. You'll see this little pin that's going to go right into that spot right there. And we're going to get the bolts and line it up. Just start it by hand, make sure it goes in smooth. Grab our 14mm socket and just tighten this up. So as tempting as it is, do not put that ABS sensor in yet, because this will get pushed back and the new hub is going to go in, and that's where you can do damage. Even though it's out in the open, you put that in after the hub is installed. So one other thing I like to do, whether it's a new knuckle or a used, the old one, I always clean surface and I install some Never Sees. Now the copper stuff is a higher temp. That way the future won't have any wheel bearings that are frozen in and won't have to work so hard. So the backing plate calipers in the front, and that's the way it mounts. Take our new wheel bearing, slide it over the spindle. Get it to seat. Now I'll take one of the bolts and start it. So before I install the bolts, I want to show you that I cleaned the threads with a wire brush and I applied some new thread locker. It's nice to install them all by hand, confirm that it's going in smoothly and no cross threading. Once you have 2 in there, it's pretty safe to say it's not. The other 2 are lined up. So I'm going to use a 17 millimeter and I'm going to snug these up. And I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. I'm going to go to the bottom side over here. Go back to the top. And then I will do the same on the side. Bring it over to the top one. So with my 17 millimeter socket, I'm going to do the same thing with the torquing. I'm going to go crisscross, 71 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to go across to the other side. Give it a quick double check. Now it's safe to install that ABS sensor. Line it right up, push down, should go nice and flat. We'll take that mounting bolt. Start it by hand. That's a 10 millimeter socket. We're just going to snug it up lightly because the torque to this is only 75 inch-pounds. 10 millimeter socket and 75 inch-pounds on that ABS sensor. Now I'm going to put our axle nut back on. And I'm just going to snug it because the torque, it's a specific torque that it has to be at. And I want the whole thing together so I can put it down and tighten it. 30 millimeter 12-point socket. That's all. And we'll torque it to specs. Now I'm just going to put some copper never-sees on the hub. I might spread it out with a little brush. Put our rotor back on. And now we're ready to put that caliper on. So now I'm going to take the caliper off that hook and I'm going to slide it around. Pay attention to that flex hose. You want to make sure it's not twisted. Kind of flatten that out a little bit and slide it on. There we go. Now we'll get our 2 bolts. There we go. Now get the bottom one. .17 millimeter socket, and we're going to snug these up before we torque them. .17 millimeter socket, and we're going to torque the caliper bracket to knuckle bolts at 65 foot-pounds. Double check. So now we're going to torque the axle nut, and I'm going to put this pry bar right here, lock it in. The axle nut torque is 215 foot-pounds. Once again, it's 12.30 millimeter. And we're going to turn this until that pry bar catches. Now you can do this on the ground with the longer pry bar. You can do it with the wheel. So to avoid any future headaches, what I like to say is, before you put the wheel back on, put it in neutral if you can't turn it right now, and turn this wheel, and if you hear scraping sound, it's probably the backing plate, and adjust it now instead of taking the wheel on and off. Go ahead and reinstall the wheel. Put the lug nuts on by hand, start them. Take our 21mm socket. We're just going to snug them up. Crisscross. Now we can lower it and torque it to factory specs. 21mm socket, and we're going to torque the wheels to 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern, crisscross. And double check. Now to reinstall the hubcap, you line up the valve stem. And then there it is. When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.